Welcome back. At the end of the last podcast, I left you with this question. Have you made up your mind on that one? I guess that you have spotted the crucial point in Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the GATT. Here it is. Any other country, not any contracting party at this point. So, any advantage, favor, privilege, and so on, granted by any contracting party to any product originating in or destined for any other country. So it doesn't need to be a WTO member state here at that point. It can be any other country. Privileges granted to any other country are sufficient for creating the obligation to grant the same privileges to all other WTO member states. As the provision says, such privileges granted to any other country shall be accorded immediately and unconditionally to the like product originating or destined for the territories of all other contracting parties. What we can take out of this is the following. As soon as a WTO member state grants any privileges to another state, independent of whether that state is a WTO member state or not, all the other WTO member states have a right to be treated the same way, in the same favorable way. So every WTO member state has a right to be treated as a most favored nation, and this goes quite far. But there is an exception. Free trade agreements are exempted, and of course there are free trade agreements, and there are many. There are a number of multilateral free trade agreements that play an important role in international trade. Those are major players in world trade, and you have the primary examples on the list: the European Union, the European Free Trade Agreement, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement that recently replaced the NAFTA, the former NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Then we have the Mercosur in Latin America and ASEAN. There are also bilateral free trade agreement. Here you have two examples of bilateral free trade agreements. The free trade agreement between the People's Republic of China and Switzerland, and the free trade agreement between Japan and Switzerland. Of course, those are just two examples. There are many more such bilateral free trade agreements across the world. And having in mind the multitude and the importance of multilateral and bilateral free trade agreements, you can imagine that many privileges are granted on the basis of such free trade agreements today, and are exempted from the most favored nation principle according to the WTO regulations. And that brings me to my next point. While originally the most favored nation principle was meant to be the rule in international trade, and free trade agreements were meant to be the exception, what happens today is that we have more and more multilateral and bilateral free trade agreements, meaning that what was meant to be the rule tends, in fact, to become the exception today. And what was intended to be the exception, namely free trade agreements, tend to become the rule today in the practice of international trade. Well, this of course leads also to the question of why the WTO regulations provide for that kind of exceptions. The reason behind this is that the overall objective of the WTO is to foster international trade. And free trade agreements contribute to that overall objective.